All right. Anyway, so let's go back to 2 Samuel. We were in the middle of chapter 13, and we had finished verse 33. Just to recap what has happened, first of all, something I want to make sure we remember from the beginning of chapter 13, even though the chapter begins with the story of Amnon and Tamar, the rape of Tamar by her brother, her half-brother or stepbrother, Amnon, we don't know who Absalom is, and yet the chapter 13 begins with Absalom. It introduces the characters that will follow Tamar and Amnon as they relate to Absalom. And that's kind of like a hint that really everything we're doing here, all of this story, is really going to end up being about Absalom. Absalom is the key figure here. And I wouldn't say necessarily only Absalom, but what we're actually going to be focusing on here from now on for a number of chapters is the relationship, the very complicated, tragic relationship between Absalom and David. Okay, so the whole story of Amnon and Tamar is really just a background so that we understand what happened to the family, what happened to Absalom and David. And of course, what we see, the end of the story that we read last week was that Absalom bided his time and he waited for an opportunity where they were going to all be out in the fields. He had all his brothers at this shearing and took advantage of an opportunity. He ordered his aide to kill Amnon, his brother. Okay, and then rumor comes back to David that Absalom had not only killed Amnon, but he had killed all of the sons, all of David's sons, and of course he was extremely, extremely upset. And then we meet Yonadav, who is a nephew of David, and he comes to David and he says, "My Lord must not think that all the young princes have been killed. Only Amnon is dead. For this has been decided by Absalom ever since his sister Tamar was violated." And he makes it very clear that Absalom is not out to murder the whole family. He is just trying to avenge what has happened to Tamar. And therefore, he wants to kill Amnon. He wants to kill his brother because of that. Now, it's interesting, by the way, if you look at the Bible and what the original biblical law is, in the case of someone raping somebody, not whether or not they're a sister or whatever, forget the sister part of it, but if someone rapes somebody, the response of the Bible is that that man has to take the woman as his wife to protect her because she is seen as having absolutely no protection. This didn't work out in this case for a number of reasons. But what we do have raised in the Bible is the concept of an honor killing, in the sense of or honor killing might be the wrong word. It's not honor killing as we know it today, but it's more like an avenging kind of killing. If somebody kills your relative, okay, then there is a certain legitimacy for the relative of the person who was murdered to go after the person who was the killer and avenge his death. But there are ways of doing it. In other words, it has to be also in conjunction with a court and all that kind of stuff. But what we do see is that there is place in the Bible for a relative to take revenge in a supervised way for the death of the relative by whoever murdered him. Okay, but what Absalom is doing is he's taking that concept of avenging the death when it wasn't a death, it was a rape. And so that is something that actually in ancient biblical times was a non-biblical more. In other words, it was a common, accepted moral thing in biblical times, but not within Israelite customs and culture, which is governed by biblical law. But in the surrounding areas, it was perfectly acceptable for someone to avenge the rape of his sister by killing the rapist. And let us remember that Absalom was the son of David, but his mother was not from the nation of Israel. His mother was a princess of Geshur. Her father was the king Talmai of Geshur, who we are going to meet very shortly. Okay, so that's just something that can give you an understanding. On the one hand, what Yonadav really is saying is that he is not Absalom is not on a murderous rage, okay? He is looking for justice. His sense of justice may not be the right way to carry this out, but this is what he's after. He's only after Amnon. He's not after everybody. So that's basically what he is now telling the king. And this is where we ended. So we're on verse 34. Absalom fled, okay? The watchman on duty looked up and saw a large crowd coming from the road to his rear from the side of the hill. Now, there really is not a whole lot of connection between Absalom fled and the watchman. What the watchman is seeing is going to be connected to the previous conversation between Yonadav and David, where Yonadav is trying to convince him, don't worry, your sons are alive. The only one who's been killed is Amnon. We can see as the conversation continues, Yonadav said to the king, see, the princes have come. It is just as your servant said. Okay, as he finished speaking, the princes came in and broke into weeping, and David and all his courtiers wept bitterly too. So what we have here is a direct connection. Yonadav said, you heard wrong, David. This is what I heard. But here we have proof. We have a watchman looking at and seeing the whole family coming. And as soon as David sees all of his sons coming, he realizes that the rumor that he had heard was wrong. What Yonadav said is right, that indeed the only one who was killed was Amnon. Okay? And basically you can understand that basically what's happening here is that everybody comes and there's two sons missing. Absalom is missing and Amnon is missing. Amnon is missing because he's dead. Absalom is missing because he's fled. So what we have here, the beginning of verse 34, Absalom fled, it kind of helps set the scene for that, okay? He fled. Who's left to come? All the rest of the sons, except for Amnon and Absalom, okay? And what we see here in verse 36 probably tells us so much about what are they weeping for? And it doesn't really say why they're weeping, but I would venture to say that they are weeping over two different brothers. They're weeping for the death of their brother Amnon, and they're weeping for the fact that their brother Absalom has become a murderer and murdered their brother. And this dual mourning is something that will carry us through the rest of the story. Because what is unique here is that this is fratricide. This is brother killing brother. And when murder is bad in any context, but when a brother kills a brother, everybody is killed. The surviving murderer is also killed in some way. The entire family is destroyed in some way. And this is, I think, when we're seeing in 36, they all came in and they all weep together. And at the end of the verse, my translation says, David and all his courtiers wept bitterly too. In the Hebrew, it says they wept a very great weeping. There's something, I think, more powerful about the way it's written in Hebrew. They didn't just weep. They wept a great weeping because there is something so terribly tragic about this entire situation when brother kills brother. Verse 37, Absalom had fled, and he came to Talmai, son of Amihud, king of Geshur. So he comes to his grandfather. Remember, his mother Maacha is the princess, the daughter of this king Talmai of Geshur. He's going to his grandfather. And now here it's very interesting. In the Hebrew, it reads as follows. Absalom had fled, and he went to Talmai, the son of Amihud, king of Geshur, and he mourned for his son all the days. Who mourned and on which son? It is written purposely, I believe, in a very ambiguous way. It's very interesting, and he mourned when the subject of the sentence at the beginning is Absalom, okay? Now, Absalom was not mourning about his son. There's nothing about Absalom's son, right? So it must be that the person mourning is David, but it doesn't say, and David mourned. It says, and he mourned. And then it says about his son, whose son? Did he mourn for Absalom, who has become a murderer and who ran? And don't forget, and we know already that Absalom ran. And in fact, the fact that Absalom ran is written 3 times in these very few verses here, 3 different times. So this is the second time. But it's almost as if it's written here in order to remind us why he is mourning over 2 sons, or why the question mark is he's mourning over which son, the son who was killed, or is he mourning over the son who fled, who is exiled, who is out of the family because he murdered his brother? And I think there is a purposeful ambiguity here that helps us understand and feel the tragedy here, that it's not a clean situation. It's a very messy, tragic situation. It says he mourned him all the days. And what does all the days mean? My English says a long time. And we'll see why the translation goes from all the days to a long time. And that's because of what's written afterwards. Okay. Verse 38. Again, Absalom fled. Okay. Absalom had fled, and he went to Geshur, and he was there for 3 years. So here we already know he fled. We already know he went to Geshur, but we have a new piece of information. He was there for 3 years. Okay. And then it says in verse 39, and King David was pining away for Absalom, for he had, well, my English says, for the king had gotten over Amnon's death. In the Hebrew, you could read it as that he was comforted on Amnon's death. Okay. Why? Okay, and this is something that goes back to verse 37. In verse 37, it says David mourned over his son all his days, all the days. And in verse 39, it says he got over Amnon, being that he stopped that intense mourning over Amnon. So you could really read this in 2 different ways. You can say that the son he's mourning over in verse 37 is indeed Amnon. And instead of all his days meaning for the rest of his life, it means for a long time, which is the translation, the English translation that my Bible has. And that makes sense in light of the fact in 39, we find out that he stops his mourning. So you can't say he mourned him all his days. He mourned Amnon all his days, if at the very end of 39, it says he got over Amnon. Now, I'm sure there's a pain that rests with him, but there's a difference between your intense mourning and grief and the next stage, where it moves kind of to a back spot, okay? On the other hand, you could read it differently. You could say that he is mourning all his days, in verse 37, for Absalom. And that was also consistent with verse 39, because in verse 39, we learn that he's pining for Absalom. He got over Amnon's death, but he's pining for Absalom. He's mourning Absalom. Absalom is not dead, but yet he mourns him because he is away from him. Imagine David, his son has been killed, and his other son was the murderer. So he cannot come to terms with the son who's the murderer. He cannot come to terms with Absalom. On the one hand, he misses him and loves him. On the other hand, he can't bear to look at him or talk to him or have him. He is in exile. He's run to Geshur, which is where David wants him to be. Okay. But it is such a terribly tragic situation where at the same time he's mourning or missing Absalom, and yet at the same time is totally disconnected from Absalom because of what he's done. And that takes us into chapter 14. I don't think that this is a good place to stop the story and put a chapter start here, but I didn't create the chapters. Someone else did. But anyway, it's clearly a continuation of the story. Joab, son of Tzruya, could see that the king's mind was on Absalom. Okay, so first of all, it's very interesting. We know Joab already. We've met him. He's played many, many roles. And it's very interesting that here, excuse me, here it's specifically, and very often Joab is introduced as the chief of staff or David's general or whatever. Doesn't always say Joab, the son of Tzruya. we know that already, that's who he is, but it's very interesting that here scripture reminds us that he's the son of Tzeruiah. Now, who is Tzeruiah? David's sister. And so there's a hint here that says David, what Yoav is going to do now, his concern for David is coming from the fact that David is his uncle. There is an emotional bond here that he's concerned about and what he's going to do now. So, of course, you could also say that Yoav is concerned for David as a king. If he's still very involved in grief over Absalom, he may not be making good kingly decisions. Maybe he's depressed, maybe he's not fulfilling his role. So there's clearly could be part of that as well. But I think that by giving us reminding us that Yoav is David's nephew, we're also being reminded that there is a more emotional family concern here as well. So Yoav sent to Tekoa and brought a clever woman from there. It says clever, wise is how I would translate it. The wise woman from Tekoa, very famous. And in fact, in the modern community of Tekoa, an artist there created a sculpture of the wise woman of Tekoa, and it stands there in Tekoa. She was indeed a very wise woman. Yoav sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there. He said to her, pretend you are in mourning, put on mourning clothes, and don't anoint yourself with oil, and act like a woman who has grieved a long time over a departed one. Go to the king and say to him thus and thus. And Yoav told her what to say. Now, first of all, to understand this story, we need to remember a few things. First of all, if you recall, after the whole incident between David and Bathsheba, it was Nathan, the prophet, who comes to David to reprimand him. How does he do it? He comes with a story as if it's a real case. He presents a case to David, and the kings in there were courts, but the king also has a kind of extrajudicial power to determine legal issues, and the king has much more leeway, has much more flexibility, more discretion. He doesn't have to judge something based on the technical word of law. He has the discretion as a king to pardon. He has a discretion as a king to make other kinds of decisions, taking into account other circumstances. And so again, we're going to have a situation like this. It will not be a prophet who brings us before David, but this wise woman from Tekoa. So Yoav is telling her to dress up, and she's going to create a situation, and she's going to be presenting her case before the king. We also have another situation. We've seen this, we haven't seen it in our studies, but in the book of Kings, we also see a situation where a woman comes out and cries before the king. And this is this kind of situation where if there's a grievance or a problem, there are times, and this is what it was common in ancient times, that an ordinary citizen could come before the king and bring their grievance to the king, and the king had the discretion to help them in a special way. So this is what Yoav is actually saying to this woman. Number one, pretend you are in a particular situation and bring this case before the king, and go before the king in that tradition of bringing your personal grievance before a king, where he has the ability and the discretion to make a decision. Now, it says here that he told her what to say, okay? And the question is, if he was going to tell her what to say, why did she have to be wise? But I think what is clear here is that he tells her how to he tells her the story. He presents the situation that she's supposed to say. But the conversation will continue between David and the woman, and he cannot anticipate, and what if David says this and what if David says that? So clearly, the way she presents the story, and certainly the way she continues in the conversation with David, was something that required a lot of wisdom on her part to do this in the right way. So now we're going to see exactly what it was he told her to say. The woman of Tekoa came to the king, flung herself face down to the ground, and prostrated herself. She cried out, "Help, O king!" The king asked her, "What troubles you?" And she answered, "Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Your maidservant had 2 sons. The two of them came to blows out in the fields where there was no one to stop them, and one of them struck the other and killed him. What does that remind you of? You could unmute if you have an answer.
Cain and
Does it remind you? Cain and Abel, exactly. Out in the field, two brothers, okay? And and what is Cain and Abel? Cain and Abel is the archetype fratricide. The first time of a murder, but it's not just murder, it's the first time brother kills brother. And so she is tying into this. Now remember, both the way Nathan presented the story of the sheep and the way this woman from Tekoa is going to present the story, on the one hand, she has to create enough similarities that it may ring some bells with David. But on the other hand, it cannot be too similar to the situation he has with Absalom. Otherwise, he'll realize from the beginning that this is a ploy and he won't respond naturally and honestly. Okay. But what she's doing here is she's immediately putting in this idea of brother killing brother. This is what we're talking about. But he doesn't catch on. Okay, it'll come back to him afterwards, but he doesn't catch on right now. Then the whole clan confronted your maidservant and said, hand over the one who killed his brother, that we may put him to death for the slaying of his brother, even though we wipe out the heir. Okay, thus they would quench the last ember remaining to me and leave my husband without name or remnant upon the earth. So she here presents, she says, what happened? One brother killed the other brother. All the relatives, as is common, as we talked about this idea of avenging the death of a relative, the relatives want to avenge the death of the son, and therefore they want to take the other son, the murderer, and kill him to avenge that death. But she says, but then what's going to happen? I only have two sons. Yes, one killed the other, but if you kill the one who was the murderer, then I end up with no sons whatsoever. And then she talks about two separate things that are more practical consequences. One, that means that there will be no inheritance. She will have no, okay, and this is also something to realize. Biblical law, the wife does not inherit. The sons, only the sons inherit. So if there are no sons, that property will go to the brothers of the deceased, which would be the brother of her husband. Okay, let's say it's her husband's property. They had two sons. The two of them would have split that property. Both sons are now dead. One the brother killed, the other one the brother's now going to be killed. So if that property has no sons to inherit it, it goes to the husband's brother. What happens to the widow? She's at the mercy of the brother, of her brother-in-law. Okay, so of course this is a serious problem for her. It's one thing if it goes to her son looks after the mother, etc. Here, there's a serious problem in inheritance. But there's a second problem, and it says, and leaves my husband without name or remnant upon the earth. Does that remind you of something?
Yeah,
this
the
is
the wife would have to marry the brother-in-law to raise
the
an
levirate, right? The levirate marriage, the situation where a man dies leaving no heir, his widow then marries the brother. Why? That first son that is born to that union is not considered to be the son of his biological father, but the son of the brother who is deceased. And in the Bible, this is said as a way to preserve the name and the inheritance, but not just the inheritance, the name of that brother who is deceased. So she's harking back to that situation as well. Not only is there a problem of inheritance, it's going to disappear from the family and it's going to go to the brothers, okay? But the name of her husband will disappear. It will be no more. In other words, we're not talking about a levirate marriage. We're talking about killing both. She had sons, okay? There's not a levirate marriage, but by killing both sons, she's in a situation where there's no name for her husband because there's no heir. There's no inheritance and there's no name. And she, by presenting this situation the way she does, in many ways, not only does it harken back to a Cain and Abel situation, but enables us to understand the terrible tragedy of fratricide, all the consequences that happen, okay? That there's no descendants, that a whole family is wiped out. when you have one brother killing the other. Okay, and she's talking about if that brother is killed. Let's continue in seeing if it solves the problem if the brother is not killed. The king said to the woman, "Go home, I will issue an order on your behalf." And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, "My lord king, may the guilt be on me and on my ancestral house. Your majesty and his throne are guiltless." And people read this as saying basically what she really is trying to say is if you don't really protect this, the guilt is on you. But you can't say to the king, the guilt is on you. So you say the guilt is on me, okay? But it's understood that what she is hinting is that, the life of my son is on your head, okay? The king said, "If anyone says anything more to you, have him brought to me, and he will never trouble you again." She's talking then about the family members who are mad because they want to take that murdering son and murder him and kill him. She replied, "Yet let your majesty be mindful of the Lord your God and restrain the blood avenger bent on destruction so that my son may not be killed." So none of these things are enough for her. She's saying, don't give me promises. Don't give me words. I need for you actually to ensure that the avengers will not kill my other son. And he said, "As the Lord lives, not a hair of your son shall fall to the ground." Okay, so David has made his ruling. Even though the murdering son, by right, should be killed, he is saying, "No, I understand there's a special situation here. I'm going to make sure he's protected." She has achieved her goal because she needed David to respond on this so-called anonymous case so that she can then bring home to David what it is her real message. And we'll just read this quickly, and of course we'll discuss it in more detail when we meet again in 2 weeks. Then the woman said, "Please let your maidservant say another word to my lord the king." "Speak on," said the king. And here's where you really see her wisdom. And the woman said, "Why then have you planned the like against God's people? And making this pronouncement, your majesty condemns himself, and that your majesty does not bring back his own banished one." Now he's starting to hint to the king, you also have a banished son. And he brings in the fact that this is going to work against, okay, it says, "Why then have you planned the like against God's people?" He brings in God, she brings in God, but she also brings something about banishing Absalom is doing an injustice or a bad thing to God's people. And if we compare it to what she was talking about before about erasing a name or erasing a remnant continuation, okay, let us remember that Absalom at this point is the favorite son to inherit David. Yeah. And so basically what she's saying, what she's hinting, is that in banishing Absalom, you are also doing a disservice for the nation, because then who is the heir? Who is David's heir? Okay? "We must all die. We are like water that is poured out on the ground and cannot be gathered up. God will not take away the life of one who makes plans so that no one may be kept banished." Okay, this is a very hard thing to understand, but it's basically understood that everybody dies eventually. So, but you have to kill, everyone dies eventually. So yes, Amnon was killed, but everybody dies eventually. Or you could say everybody dies eventually. God will not take away the life of one who makes plans. Somebody who has, let's say, somebody who can still accomplish things, something like that. Okay. 15. "And the reason I've come to say these things to the king, my lord, is that the people have frightened me." Okay. The people here, she's going back to her parable, the people being her relatives. "Your maidservant thought I would speak to your majesty. Perhaps your majesty would action his handmaid's plea. For your majesty would surely agree to deliver his handmaid from the hands of anyone who would seek to cut off both me and my son from the heritage of God." And here we say the heritage of God, that's also the territory, the biblical territory that every family in Israel is entitled to, going back to the original, allocation of lands to the tribes. "Your maidservant thought, let the word of my lord the king provide comfort, for my lord the king is like an angel of God understanding everything good and bad. May the Lord your God be with you. Okay, so she brings in God, she brings in the nation, she talks about, how the heritage of God, all these things that seem to be a little bit extraneous to this little story that she's talking about her son, her other son. And at this point, he cottons on and he says, in the reply, the king said to the women, do not withhold from me anything I ask you. The women answered, does the Lord the king speak? The king asked, is Joab in league with you in all this? At this point, he realizes what she is talking about. Okay, so I want to stop there, and we will go back in 2 weeks. We will go back and have a bit more of an in-depth analysis of what are some of the messages that this wise woman of Tekoa are bringing to David, and how is he then going to understand it, and what will be, the next, the continuation of this chapter. Okay, so we are in the middle of chapter 14, and we'll take that up again in 2 weeks. Anybody have any questions or comments?
I think David must have thought he was partly responsible for all of this, because in chapter 13, verse 21, he says, but when King David heard all these things, he was very wroth. But what then? He doesn't do anything. And you would have expected him to have reprimanded Absalom.
Amnon. Yeah.
Amnon, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
But he doesn't. So you can imagine Absalom must have felt really aggrieved and been harboring all of this before he did something. So David is, I suppose, why didn't he do anything? I suppose a guilty conscience.
Well, I think that's a very good point. And I think you get a sense there in that story that David, as king of Israel, is trying to wipe it all under the rug. Okay. And we see there's a pattern with David wiping things under the rug, because that's exactly what he did with the whole story with Bathsheba.
Yeah.
He marries her, well, whose child it is. I mean, it's all very, let's not talk about it, and everything is hidden. And that's one of the things that Nathan says to him. You did all this in hiding, but it's going to come out. Your punishment is going to be in front of everyone. And of course, that punishment is Absalom. Absalom is going to rebel, and Absalom is going to sleep with David's concubines in front, under the sun, in front of everyone. Okay, so there's no question that everything that's happened with Absalom is part of a punishment to David. But I would say also that David, what did David do with Bathsheba, who was very happily married to Uriah? He destroyed a family. He destroyed a family. And what's happening here is that David's family is going to be destroyed. You cannot put together the pieces in a family after a brother has killed a brother. And everything that happens from here on is just, a development of all of this, one after the other. There's a saying in Judaism from the Talmud, sin produces more sin. We like to think that sin produces punishment, but sometimes what it actually produces is more sin, which in itself is the punishment. You get wrapped up, you just spiral and get involved in things that you would ask yourself before any of this happened, what have I done? And I think that's like what you're referring to in a certain sense, Carol. And I think it's very much what's happening in this whole story.
Yeah, I was thinking very much like Carol, but it also goes back to Jacob and Dinah when she was rejected. And it was interesting that it was the brothers of the mother's brothers, of flesh and blood brothers, the ones that took the law into their own hands to deal with it. And it's Absalom, which is Tamara's brother. Yeah, that's right. Who's actually dealing with it. Reminds us a bit in the way, one hates to say it, of what Muslims do, that it's the sons that defend the honor, not so much the father, the sons of the mother kind of thing, where they get this idea that they defend the
right. Well, there's no question that this Muslim, quite barbaric custom today has its roots in these ancient traditions. And I think there's no question, I like what you're saying about Jacob and Levi, because what they did was very much avenging, again, well, this was before, the children of Israel exist as a nation, before the Torah and the Ten Commandments, etc., were given. So what they do reflects much more the ancient Middle Eastern culture, which is, like Absalom, to avenge the rape, not just to avenge a death, but to avenge a rape. And so very much similar. And of course, Jacob is not happy. Jacob is very interesting. At the time, Jacob is silent on both counts. He's silent, doesn't do anything after the rape, but he's also silent after Jacob and Levi go in and kill all the people in Shechem. He's silent both times. Only at the end of his life does he reprimand Jacob and Levi for what they have done. And so you have this sense that he really doesn't like that they went to too great an extreme, which, very possible way of looking at it. But yeah, it definitely it reminds us of that situation as well. Okay, anyone else? All right, so we will say goodbye for tonight. And again, no classes for 2 weeks. So we're actually meeting in 3 weeks. I miscalculated that. Today's the 9th. We will be meeting in 3 weeks on the 30th. The next 2 weeks, we are on break for the holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay.
Hag Sameach.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.